was a pleasure for me to see that IDnext had actually dedicated a panel to digital identity and travel, because it is a topic close to my heart. I've worked in border management for many years, and the last decade I've spent working on creating seamless, contactless passenger facilitation, gathering stakeholders around the passenger to create an identity management that not only serves the passenger, but also serves all the stakeholders that are involved. There are three key factors to creating this, which is trust, biometrics, and a digital identity. And the three speakers we have lined up for you today, each within their own context, will touch on this subject. Trust, because trusting onboarding a new employee with creating a trust key. Biometrics, because you want to verify remotely an employee. And digital identity, we will hear a lot of updates on what is going on in the world of digital identity and travel, and I think we will all realize that travel will change for us very soon. So we'll have these presentations. If there is time, we'll take some questions, and then if there is time at the end, we could have a panel discussion. But let's see. So let's start without further ado. I'll introduce the first speaker, Simon Hania. He's the Senior Director and Data Protection Officer at Uber, as well as a member of the Supervisory Board of SIDN, the Registry and Administrator of .nl domain, as you all know. Previously, he served as Vice President for Privacy and Security at TomTom and as a Technical Director at Access for All. He often speaks at seminars and conferences on internet, IT, and security-related topics, and he served on the executive boards of various organizations, including AMSIX, COIN, and NLNet Labs. And he will be presenting on remote identity verification using biometrics.
Thank you, Annette. So, as Annette said, I am working at Uber, which you probably know as a company. And my role there is to be the data protection officer, which essentially means that my role is to help the company behave responsibly with the data it uses from you or about you. But not only you as a driver, as a passenger, but also you as a driver. And what I want to do is show you how in this context we use several technologies, partially of which we've developed ourselves, also sometimes sensitive technologies such as biometrics, in order to make sure, as a passenger or as someone who has ordered food, you get it delivered or you get driven by the right person. So this is what it shows. How do we know that that individual, that lady, is indeed your driver and not someone else, and that delivery person indeed is the one that was onboarded by us, and to make sure that it's the right person delivering. That's not an easy task, because all of these people work in dispersed locations across the world, across the country, and do not have a home base other than their own home. It's not like we have many offices elsewhere. So these are all remote workers. Remote workers pre-COVID, remote workers while COVID, and after COVID. So that's the challenge. And what these people could do, and it happened in the past, is that they allowed someone else to take their position. Because if you have a car, which is a lot of money to invest, then it makes sense to have someone else drive at times where you're not available. But that's not allowed. That's the substitution part. There was a huge issue a couple of years back in Amsterdam, as you can see. It raised all kinds of issues because drivers need to be vetted. They need to have a driver's license, taxi license, and so on. And you can't just have someone else drive. It's illegal, but it's also unsafe. And the same actually happened in France and in the UK with delivery persons, where we were confronted with people who were not legal immigrants, who were actually victim of human trafficking and then forced to work as a delivery person by substituting the person we had onboarded. So that's where it starts, with the onboarding. We call these delivery persons and drivers in general earners because they make money on our platform. And what we do is, in order to ascertain that these people are qualified in multiple ways, legally qualified but also professionally qualified to perform their jobs, there is an onboarding process in which documents are verified, all of the very physical stuff. You'd be surprised how much physical stuff a technology company can have to do in order to get this right. So there's a few elements, and then people are off to go. But then how do we know that it's the actual person delivering when they turn up for their work? That remote identification and subsequent authentication is a very big challenge, because people are on the road in different locations, and these are just the ordinary things, of course, you know all about what you can do to identify someone. The interesting part here is also where you are, because an Amsterdam taxi driver is not licensed to operate in Brussels. So if he would show up in his car in Brussels, while he may be perfectly identifiable, he's in the wrong location, so he should not be admitted, and vice versa. Now we also have to realize that all of these identification processes need to be done on a regular basis, not necessarily each and every time, but frequently, just to make sure that the right person is in the car or on the bike. And while they are identifying, that takes time, which deprives them from the potential to earn money. So there is an inherent challenge here. We need to do this as frictionless as possible, obviously. Now, of course, we had all of the stuff in place before these incidents I just referred to popped up. We have the username passwords, we have the one-time verification, but that all depends on something either you know or maybe have, your phone. And this is typically what happened. If I want to substitute, I just hand my phone to someone else and here you go. Now the thinking then became, how do we make sure that we can have the right person? Of course, that's with biometrics. Now there's several alternatives. The first thing is, of course, you could think about, well, most smartphones, and if people buy a modern day smartphone, they have biometrics. But as some of you probably already know, is that on a phone you can have multiple identities. So I could still enable someone else to do it, and then, of course, the phone signals it, but it requires an additional expensive onboarding process if things go wrong. You'd be surprised how often people buy a new phone. Here you go again with the onboarding process. That's challenging. And the key actually issue is that all of the smartphone biometrics is not anchored to government-issued IDs. The anchor is what we obviously do with our onboarding process, but that can be thwarted with this. We want to make sure that the same person is holding the phone that actually onboarded. Now we could do this ourselves maybe, if we would be able to access the onboard biometric sensors at the onboarding process. But that's not what's allowed by the smartphone manufacturer, for very good reasons, but it gives us an issue. But there are sensors that we can use. Of course, we can use the camera, and we'll get back to that later, how we've done this. So, onboarding biometrics has several limits, which actually makes it fairly useless to us. Now, there was a thought with someone, well, we have these nice biometric keys. Now, in which effectively you have the fingerprint on the device itself, but currently that still has its limits. In short, it's a bit of a financial and logistical nightmare, given the huge amount of phones people have. And these fobs get lost, and you can argue, well, put them on your car key and then you have no issue. Well, the logistics in a vehicle with this are mind-blowing. So, we decided to not go there yet. What did we do? What we decided to do is what we call selfie comparison. So we have a picture at onboarding. We ask the driver once in a while to take a picture, and then we compare them. And at comparing, we try to do as much as possible through automated means. But then you're hit with a snag. Because this comparison, under law, is considered to be biometric processing. Not the picture itself, but the actual comparison using technology. This is not biometric recognition, it's biometric verification of a known identity using two pictures. So, it's essentially prohibited by the General Data Protection Regulation. Unless there's legislation in a country allowing it, but actually no country has that legislation, except for the Netherlands. But it's crafted in such a way that it cannot be used. So we ran an advisory process, which is called a prior consultation with the Dutch Data Protection Authority on this back in 2019, asking them whether the specific exemption under the Dutch implementation law of the GDPR could be used. And we asked them actually to also check whether that could also be used outside of the Netherlands. And the answer they gave after a long and tedious process was actually a negative advice. They didn't say no, they gave a negative advice, because we could still decide to do it, but then the effect would be an investigation and a no. So we did not go for the forced biometrics. Not possible. There is one alternative under GDPR, which is explicit consent. But the issue there, of course, it needs to be given freely. And you can't give free consent when you're forced to deliver your pictures. So it doesn't add up. So we were stuck. We couldn't do it. High pressure from other parts of government, including Aldermen in Amsterdam, that we should do something right. It went up all the way also in France to not only parliamentarians but others. But in the end, we were able to crack the nut by actually making the biometrics voluntary. So what have we done? People are allowed, the drivers and the delivery persons, when they are up for a verification, they are obliged to deliver a picture. That can be done. But then they have a choice each and every time whether they want it to be compared with biometric technology, or whether they want us to do that with a manual comparison. And that choice is made each and every time. It remains one-on-one verification, and the biometric data, the biometric template generated on the fly, is actually deleted right away and will not survive 24 hours. So that reduces the risk of biometrics. And so here you can see what it looks like. You get a question each and every time, and actually I believe that in some countries these even flip, so the photo comparison sometimes is at the top, sometimes is at the bottom, to really make sure it's a free choice and not nudge and so on. And we have extensive explanation of the entire process, which you can pull up if you press the I.
Does any driver ever choose human?
Yeah, you'd be surprised how many. Can't reveal, but it's the infamous 80-20 rule applies, roughly. Yeah. I won't say the exact percentages, but they're also steady over time. Yeah, so it helps. Now, this means that the overwhelming majority does choose biometrics, and there is a bit of change, but not much, so that's helpful. Now, it is expensive, do realize, but it's more expensive to have the other issues. So, but then, what do you do if someone is found, the pictures are found to not match? Well, the biometrics delivers a confidence value, and if it's too low, we have a second stage in which 3 human beings look at the picture and arrive at the conclusion whether these pictures are of the same individual. That same process is also happening if there is no match found, either by the initial biometrics or by the human stage. So if for the first stage the conclusion is pictures don't match, then we have an additional 3-person check. And the reason to do this is also that we sometimes need to deactivate a driver from the platform, kick him out, to put it a bit more bluntly. And that's a human decision-making process, so we do not do this with automated means. And the reason to do this, and the numbers obviously need to be low, and we want them to be low, there's no point in kicking drivers from the platform, other than if they're really trying to be substituted illegally. But it's also to try and avoid potential issues that the biometrics can have. We've all seen, it's been in the past also, allegations, actually facts about, for instance, the biometric comparison being racially biased. And that's why there is a 2-layer of 3-person decision-making to actually verify what happened there. So this is how we've set it up, which runs actually across the entire of Europe. The challenge we have is that we've all built this ourselves, need to maintain it. The anchor to the government ID, all of the processing to actually do this. Whereas it's of course something that on platforms is a common issue. So there could be a lot of benefit to arrange for this in a more common way. All right, that concludes my presentation. I have a slide with questions, but actually on request of Annette, we'll do that after the 3 presentations. Or
no,
you
can take
okay,
1 or 2 questions.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So how do you prevent the driver to hand over his mobile phone after having completed all of their checks? And simply hand over the phone to his neighbor and let the neighbor drive?
I'm not saying this is perfect. That's not what this prevents, that someone hands over the phone after having it completely done right away. But the checks are also done randomly while on the road. And it doesn't make sense for people to sit next to a driver. Yeah, so it is a scenario that could be used, but it's not really something logical people would do. Yeah.
A lot of the facial recognition challenges are about prosthetic tech detection, MIFIs, right? So do you have facilities for that to make sure that it's not a mask or a deepfake attack or someone holding a piece of paper in front of the camera, and especially if you didn't do the human check, it's going to be very difficult.
That's embedded in the facial technology we use. It's no secret we use Microsoft Face API, which is just public, and it's pretty good at detecting that. And also detecting it, for instance, the most common one is a picture of a picture. So I have a picture on one smartphone and I take a picture of that picture. That's the way people do it, and that's fairly easily detectable as it appears. What we also have to realize is that we tend to have a fairly conservative confidence level. So if the confidence is not really high, then we'll do a manual verification. Yeah.
Yeah,
one more.
Yeah. Just to.
Question.
So on the 3 human process, where you mentioned like we have 3 humans, especially because of the bias problem and stuff like that. How are those people selected? Because I can imagine that if you have 3 people from the same country with the same background, you're still going to have that bias, maybe unconscious bias problem. Is there any like...
There's distribution on that, that's one. The second is that these people also specifically trained, but also get reviewed on, so if there is too many inconsistencies, that's a reason to look what's happening. And the reality is actually that we're finding ourselves now in a situation in which we sometimes conclude that the technology is better than the humans. So we're at that tipping point, and that's hard to digest, because what do you do then? But yeah. Yeah.
I think it is, well, coming from a border control perspective, the technology factor is better than the human factor, we know. But in the end, it's the human factor that decides. But if you if you up against the machine will win in this respect.
No, but it's important. There's 2 different layers. There's a different layer of match, non-match, and there's another layer of decision making, which takes also more factors into account. That's also important.
But this itself could have a whole conference, seriously. And there are a lot of conferences about this. And then we haven't touched on the algorithm and et cetera, et cetera. So thanks a lot, Simon. That was super interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Manuel Garate. Yes, please get ready. Yes, while I will quickly introduce you. Manuel is a head of identity and access management at Booking.com, has developed software for 15 years and is an IAM product owner for 5 years. And as he says in his own words, in IAM I can bring together my 3 passions: software development, security, and agile methodologies. Manuel is a certified system auditor, CISA, and also a certified professional Scrum product owner. And all this experience allows him to focus on binding it all together towards delivering maximum value in an agile and wasteless way. And he will be presenting to us establishing a trust anchor upon digital onboarding of remote employees. I think it's links in. Yes, perfect. So
Thank you very much.
good luck.
Let me see how this works. So thank you very much. Thank you, Simon, because I actually think this presentation is going to tie in nicely with that. I'm not going to be talking anything Booking.com specific. It's more from a generic point of view about establishing that trust anchor and onboarding digital identities, especially for remote employees, which I think is very relevant in the time we live in. Working from anywhere is something that's not new, let's say after the pandemic, but it has significantly changed the approach from an identity and access management point of view, the way we do that. So before COVID, working from anywhere, working from home was basically a problem that had to do with authentication. And I think Simon actually put it really nicely. So when they're trying to do biometrics, they're trying to validate if the person on the other side is who we expect them to be. So in the past, if we were doing working from home, working from anywhere, it typically is we know about these 2,000 employees, and suddenly there's a snowy week coming, and 20% of them are going to be working from home. We know who they are, but now they're going to be doing that. So yeah, we need to make sure that we can authenticate who they are. We have biometrics in place, or we have MFA set up, and so on. But again, we knew who we were trying to authenticate. It was also about IT services preparedness. So do we have the right systems? Are we capable of scaling? Or will basically that additional load, if everyone has to work from home tomorrow, bring us down as a service? But suddenly, that reality changes. In the past, working from anywhere, yeah, it's a hard problem, but we knew what we were doing. We knew how to solve those problems. Biometrics, MFA, setting up those factors. Right now, or after this year with COVID, when that working from anywhere, working from home is prolonged, the challenge is not about authentication anymore. It has nothing to do with that. This is about identity verification, because now we are not saying, yeah, these 2,000 people who know we know who they are, now we need to authenticate them. Now we're saying, well, if we are 6 months working from anywhere, people are going to be onboarded into an organization. Now I need to authenticate these people, but I don't have any trust anchor. I don't have anything to validate against. So the problem totally shifts, and it's a different thing. The interesting thing I noticed during this time is actually almost every organization in the world has a very fundamental weakness in this, and we have not been paying attention to that. And we'll see that in a minute. So first of all, let's discuss, when we say chain of trust, what we mean. Chain of trust is basically that sequence of different assumptions you rely on, built upon each other, linked to each other, so that eventually you can assure one of the extremes in the chain, authentication, access, authorization, but they are built on top of previous assumptions until you get to that root that we call a trust anchor. The farther away that trust anchor is from the end use case that we want to solve, authorization, authentication, the more blurred it becomes, and the more critical it becomes, because more things are built on top of that. So when talking about working from home, let's look at how that, it's an example, but how that chain of trust could look like. So the closest thing we have is the user ends up getting access only to the resources they need, and we are talking about employees in this instance, so we are talking about only to the corporate systems they need to do their job, or only to the documents, or the whatever that is. That basically assumes that we already know who the user is unequivocally. We authenticated them with MFA on a very, very reliable way. But that assumes that the user is providing MFA biometrics strong enough so that we can actually know that. Fine. But that basically assumes that the user has, prior to that, set up their MFA, their biometrics, or whatever that is in our identity provider, which assumes that the user is allowed to do that at a point in time, set up that MFA. From this point backward, organizations will differ. This is just an example, that is a very typical example. We only allow people to do that when they are at the office. Okay, so I have a new phone, okay, you get to the office, in the office, connected to the network, you get to that website and you establish or go to IT services, whatever that is, but you need to be at the office, okay? That is assuming that that particular user can access the office, which is assuming the user is an employee, which is assuming the identity of the employee is validated, is verified. There are a lot of assumptions, and that means any link which is broken or is weak enough, it's bringing everything down. But here we were saying, well, I mean, if you're an employee, you're at the office, you set up your MFA, you go home, you do MFA, and you access. Now, what happens if you never come to the office? Actually, what happens if I hire somebody in the other side of the world, in Singapore, we don't have an office there, they never come to the office, and now we need to give them access to do MFA and access our systems. Where is now that trust anchor that we were talking about, which we were saying coming to the office because you're an employee? And that sounded like it's fine, good enough, but now that doesn't work. So what do? First thing you do, well, we always say, well, you create a ticket with IT support and they will give you one-time code to access. What is IT support going to do? So are they going to say, yeah, send me your passport, I will check that indeed it's you, and then say, yeah, that they don't know how to do that, as they shouldn't. Okay, then we send a one-time code to their work email so that they configure that and they can access. But if we're saying we want to validate that it's indeed you, because someone might have stolen your password, then they probably have access to your email anyway. So one-time code to your work email doesn't work. Okay? We send a one-time configuration code to your personal email. How do we know what your personal email is? If we're saying somebody might have impersonated you, yeah, this is my work email, my personal email, send that to me and I'll configure it, of course. Doesn't work. Okay, come on. When you sign your contract, you tell me your email, your personal email, and then I give you a one-time code to your personal email and configure it. But again, you are not signing a contract in person anyhow, so I have to send something over as a reaction to somebody sending something over to me. So how do I know that someone is sending me the right personal email? And we get to this point, which I love, which is we have a government-issued ID that somebody sends to us saying, yeah, I'm a new employee, I just went through recruitment, that's amazing, here's my passport. As you can see, it's me, and this is my email address, personal email address, send me that code for me to configure. Now, who's validating that passport there? Is our HR department? I'm sure all our HR departments are getting those passports, opening them, reviewing them with a magnifying glass, and absolutely be certain that they are real and not fake. That's not happening. In fact, most of the time they're storing, not opening, done. And this is where it becomes a difference. So the process Simon was talking about was indeed authentication. Once you have that, because in that use case it's very weird that I impersonate when onboarding, but when talking about employees and talking about someone accessing our systems to access sensitive data, it could happen. And all I have to do is send you someone else's passport, and you validate that you want to hire them, and then you give me a code, and then I access all your systems. So we always say zero trust is not about there's no perimeter, it's the perimeter shifts from the network to the identity. This is basically what it means. If you don't protect that identity, if you let people into that identity, you're giving them access inherently to a lot of things. So that's basically the trust anchor. Where does the chain of trust start? In the past, we were saying by assuming because you are an employee, you can access, but it was weak enough and we didn't see it. Now we're saying, well, my trust anchor needs to be, I know that you are indeed who you say you are, and that's not what we are seeing at the moment. we have lived with the delusion that our recruitment process guaranteed the identity of newcomers. But as we can see, that I think the compensation of the physical presence was enough that we have not been seeing enough or too many problems with that. But as this decentralizes, it's not going to happen so often. We were going to start seeing it's easier to impersonate. So why don't I simply create a fake? Why don't I create a fake CV with a fake passport? The CV is amazing, so you want to hire me, and then you send me whatever codes, and I do whatever I want in your system. So that was the anchor in the past, and the question remains: since you are not doing that anymore, now you have totally remote employees, or you will start having totally remote employees. Do you know where your trust anchor is? Where are you putting your blind faith and relying on top of that? What I'm saying is we are not, as organizations, really doing identification at all. We don't have experts on validating identity. Because impersonation is going to become easier, the risk will get higher, and it will happen more and more and more. Our chain of trust is really not hooked to anything if we don't do that. So it's basically a dangling chain of trust. And every organization is exposed to that risk. Because unless you're saying we are totally local and people never work from home or never start from home, you will end up getting into this. Even if you did, what you're saying is, well, we have the risk in the sense we are not validating the identity, but we are choosing to accept the fact that someone coming into the office won't really lie to our faces as good enough to trust them. Well, that's up to every organization to leverage how risky that is. Again, is the risk real? Well, we do MFA because stealing credentials happens. So we are saying, yeah, we don't rely, we know people do try to impersonate. What we're saying now is, well, they have other mechanisms. In fact, the stronger MFA becomes, the more difficult it's going to be for me to try to impersonate the very, very validated John Smith in this company, and easier is going to be to create a fake John Doe and try to get that person hired. So it's going to become more and more attractive. An attacker with a fake name and a fake CV is the only thing that will be needed. And the problem with that is you can even use machine learning to create thousands of CVs, fake passports, and send them all over the LinkedIn or whatever that is. And sooner or later, someone's going to hire one of those. Because again, yeah, it can be a fake Indian driving license from 1987, and the organization has no idea how to check if the font is the right one or whatever. So yeah, it's going to start happening more and more. Now, with that in mind, since the reward is going to be higher and the cost is going to be lower, the occurrence is going to go up. So yeah, with that in mind, what can we do about it? So the good news is there are vendor solutions already out there which offer identity verification as a service. And what that basically means is they have both human and machine learning procedures to validate first the identity document. So is this a valid Indian driving license from 1987? Yes, it's real. The document is real. It means you can trust that document exists. Now, okay, second step, you have a live, to avoid deepfake or whatever, live video challenge validating that the user on the other side of the device is indeed the person representing the document. And of course, that comes with heavy restrictions as to where information is stored and whether you discard in the moment you do the validation. But that's there. And as the organization, you don't really need to keep that data. You can say, no, yeah, I mean, we do that validation, but we don't store your biometric, we don't store your personal document. And also one very nice thing is you can avoid multiple identities per user because you can onboard a person with several accounts, and still they would provide the same identity linked through that mechanism of identity validation, which is very, very nice for access reasons. So to wrap it up, with this chain, basically what we're saying is cut that there, and instead of relying on questionable reasons, go for properly validating the user identity or the employee identity. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Questions?
This very same example is happening in banking law, because banks come to business with unvalidated people, and there's a number of technologies and outsourcing options. What about adding a bank ID to or bank account? As an employee, you need a bank account to validate that. It's derived identification, I know, but it gives extra strength. Yep. And besides, many companies also require diplomas or licenses or whatever other data. As a recruiter, you need a lot of information to validate a lot more than just the identity. That whole set together is not so easy to counterfeit, I think.
That makes sense, and in fact, I mean, it is very parallel to if you have KYC already as a reality, this would be KYE, so know your employee. You can't do that. The problem you have with that is your providers always need to give you that kind of assurance. If every bank is doing that, great, in every part of the world, I mean. But if someone isn't, now
so you should have ring-fenced secure and less secure areas. Exactly. Maybe that's another help to reduce the risk.
I think that's a very, very good point. Absolutely.
But if you can solve it for 90% of the people, you have solved it for 90%, right? And you can spend more time on the 10%.
Unless one of those 10% you don't solve is high privilege user because it's a system domain administrator. Or are you saying we will never hire domain administrators in, I don't know, in
I think you will never solve it for 100% of the coming 10 years. I mean, unless you're willing to wait 10 years, you have to do something else.
You can go that direction, or you can say, organization is using the recruitment process, this vendor, which is basically validating your identity and giving me the assurance before they are onboarded, provisioned into my system, this person is indeed Mike Johnson. And now, knowing that it's Mike Johnson and that they have provided this email address, you can send them their one-time code and do that. But it is embedded in my onboarding. You can go that direction, you can go the other direction, but which is going to also be less expensive, but at the same time, you might not cover everything. And again, I would hesitate to leave 10% of my user base unchecked.
But I don't know, 20%, I think Henk said it right, so about 20-30% of the world population doesn't have an identity document, so you're excluding those by definition.
But keep in mind, I'm talking about corporate employees. So I'm talking about onboarding.
Yeah, so you're excluding people anyway, that's what my point. But which in the Netherlands is fine, right? By law obliged to eliminate them, but that differs per country.
But, so what I'm saying here is, if I'm onboarding an employee on the other side of the world, they are going to need to give me some kind of documentation. If we were talking about customers, for example, in that case, I would say, okay, it's a different problem because you might have that problem that you don't have. So yeah, for customer, that would be a reality. But for employees, I'm going to expect to have some kind of documentation that I can use to formalize your belonging to the company.
So how are you solving the right to work then?
The what, sir?
The right to work, that they are allowed to work within your company. Is that something that is being checked as well?
So we're talking about
permits and taxpayers.
Well, keep in mind, at this point, we are talking about identity validation and authentication, knowing who the user is. From that point, you branch the is allowed, you have authorization on one side, and then you have on the other side the bureaucracy of can I hire this person, which is something would be established at the legal level, but with the benefit that my legal department can now say, okay, this person, and I know who that person is, legally, can they work for us or not? Do they have a permit or not? But we are not talking about, okay, because I cannot work for your company, but I want to be paid by your company, I'm going to ask my cousin who lives in the States to give me his passport. We are quite alike, send you that, and then you allow me. That wouldn't work precisely because of this process in which I'm validating it's you and not your cousin. So, but yeah, work permit, it's not so much about validating who the employee is, but about can they do this.
Yeah, but it's an authorization based on the identity.
Always. Authorization is always based on identity, yeah.
Right, and we've seen that problem as well, putting my banking hat on, so to speak. But that was only when there was a government enforced lockdown, so people were actually not allowed to move out of their homes. We see now that we're going through a full digital onboarding process for employees. But there's always the backup that if it's too difficult or it doesn't work, you just come into the office and use the old school physical security guard who are trained in identity documentation verification. So there's always this backup. But I think it is interesting to see if we really go to full digital, what will happen then with those questionable cases, because you'll always have.
I'm hiring people in Asia, so I'm not going to ask them to come to Amsterdam. So, but yeah.
So basically you've moved your trust route from something where you were in physical contact with this person to something where you're no longer in contact, and you've now hired another company to make that trust decision for you. The CTO of that other company gave a very same presentation last week, where he told me that they're using the digital technology to onboard their new employees. How can you make this trust assessment then?
Yeah, so of course it's about having the due diligence done on the vendor, but keep in mind, if I understood correctly, the vendor company is providing, I'm the customer and they're validating identity for my customer. And they're of course validating identity for their employees in the same or a different way. That's not really of my concern. What I want to see is the assurances that they're doing the right processes in the right way and they're storing that information the right way. And yeah, all those processes are there.
So they're not using their own technology for their own.
Well, that would be one of the hopeful assumptions, yes.
Your own dog.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. Very interesting. I think it was gentleman over there who said it'll take another 10 years before we can fully do it digital. I hope it can be less. It's either because we have It's Me, or because the government is providing us a trusted digital identity that we can verify and use in a self-sovereign manner. And I don't think it's going to take another 10 years. That would be really, no. If they can do it in Belgium, they can do it in Belgium right now.
We need to accept the 80/20 rule, I think. Yeah. And make it easier for 80% and make it special for 20%.
But that's
of having something 100%.
Coming from the border control perspective, it's I always say it's 96, 97, 98% to 2%, 3%, 4%. And
yeah, but not everybody's traveling, so you know
Exactly.
when you travel that you have
Yeah.
a certain, it's not for everyone, so you know you need to have a passport, the visa, the COVID and all the other things.
but
So
then
it's
you,
something else.
Yeah, that's where people wanted to travel. But if you look at COVID and all the kids all of a sudden need to do their classes from home, that was not an option. Everybody had to do that.
Yeah.
But if you're in a poor family and you have 4 kids, you don't have the money to buy those for a laptop. So that's where the 80/20 comes in then, if we do that for identity as well. You need to take into account that there will be some people who are the special cases, they can't go in the happy flow.
but this is border control as well. Some cases we don't want in the happy flow. We want in, no. This is not a joke. This is not a joke. This is a security matter. Somebody with an Afghan passport doesn't have an e-passport yet. I hear they're getting them, but we would rather have an extra look because there's all these extra questions we have to ask. So there's actually a flow for some more probably bona fide and maybe less bona fide. But exactly. This is what it is. We have Cor, who will tell us a lot more about what's happening today. Cor de Jonge is team lead and business owner at PKI at the Dutch Judicial Information Services at the Ministry of Justice and Security. And after having been a court clerk and having been involved in management of the court for more than 20 years, he made the switch to working on government projects in various roles in the field of IT. Cor has the lead development and on the development and implementation of a public key infrastructure for extended access control, PKI EAC, for border management and immigration. crucial work. He is a country representative in various fora for the European Commission, but also for the EU at ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, who is the responsible for travel document standards. And he is also the vice chair and on the board of the technical subgroup that advises the EU Commission on technical matters regarding border crossing, breeder and identity documents. So, Cor, please go ahead. Thank you.
In a way, my presentation will be a little bit different than we've heard until now, because I'm government, I'm more looking policy-wise and what we will have to do with it. So there are various initiatives, and they all have, to my opinion, pretty much a different point of view. If we look into the EU, it's about digital IT, it's about mobile identification and self-sovereign ID. If you're looking to ICAO, it's more border crossing, so much more seamless travel. There are a lot of similarities, but there are some differences. October last year, the European Council put a challenge on the road and said, bring us a digital ID based on eIDAS and make it happen for every citizen of the EU. There are a few pillars for that, and they say strengthen the national eIDs based on eIDAS, it's called before this morning. Make the user in control. That's a huge difference when we look to ICAO, but EU says make the user in control also for his personal wallet. And if it comes to identities, linked identities and digital identities, make the private sector make it happen. Let the private sector make it happen. And then there are some goals with it, and I said it before, it's user control, so the user, the inhabitant of the EU has a wallet, should has a wallet, and the benefits of it. And the identities are linked, with the identities comes credentials. We heard it before this morning. When you have a digital identity who is trusted by the EU, then you have credentials. And there are use cases defined as car renting, seamless travel, but I come to that, public health, payments, and bank logins, as we heard in the questions here before. And where can we then use it? It's in public services, so it's Amazon, it's Booking, it's Uber, it's whatever they want. You have a relying party because you establish some kind of trust between you as a user and the company who is delivering the goods or whatever, the services. And they will use it on very large platforms. And if it comes to it, then there will be a third party that does the electronic identifications, as you said before. So that's from the EU perspective, it's much more given a context of the way how they are looking. And then they say seamless flow is a probable use case. So it's not a goal as itself. Could be a benefit, could be not. ICAO does it another way. They say based on an identity and an identity document, always, because that's their way of living, that's the way they go. And they say separate the data and separate the document, and then you have VC, which stands for virtual credentials. And that's the way they were working. And they do it in different layers. I come to that. They call it a hybrid model. But then you have data, you can add more data to it. Here stands a PC, it can be something in the cloud, it can be a service on premise, it can be whatever to make to add data to your virtual credentials. As long as they can establish a relationship in a cryptographical way between the credentials and the things are added. So there needs to be always trust to what is there and what is added. I'll come to that. There are 3 layers at the moment. So I say there are 3 types. DTC stands for Digital Travel Credentials. That's a standard within ICAO. So it's not a challenge put on the road, it's already a standard. That's also a difference, a very big difference. And they say, first of all, we can start with digital credentials on a phone, on whatever, based on the booklet we have all. So you can show your digital credentials, but you have to carry your passport or your ID card with you if there is a misunderstanding or whatsoever. If in border crossing the things are not sure, then they can do a double check for that reason. They can compare. Second step is add data to it, make more pictures to it. We've seen it also in Europe. We've seen it in Italy, for example. In your ID card or your passport, there's a photo, face front. There's other data group on the chip on your ID card or passport, and they have 2 pictures on the side. So you have 3 photos to compare. So that's a possibility. It's not given, but it's a possibility right now. And the third option is make it only digital and get rid of the book. And that's the 10 years you mentioned. We think. So they have defined use cases for that, and there's always the biometric match. Also, as the gentleman before said, there is a photo in the digital credentials, make another photo, or walk through a lane or whatsoever and be catched. That will be always the base on the identification. And for that's a detail. It's in the chip in the DG data group 2. As I said before, you may choose as a state for a higher quality or to add more pictures to make it to become more trustworthy, the data and the person you have in front of you. And then you can add exactly more. It is web-based, it's the photography, and as we said before, accuracy of the data needs to be increased. We need to be more sure is the person in front of you the person who says who he is or she is. And that's a benefit from ICAO perspective. Make traveling more speed up when it comes to border control, when it comes to boarding, when it comes to tax-free shopping or whatever. So creating this digital travel credentials, as I said, type 1 can be created. We do it right now. Separate the data, do it in a digital way, and keep the passport or ID card aside. Type 2 is add more data to it. There is a special logical data structure added in the chip for that reason. You can be adding more photos, but you also can add visa information, or you can entry and exit registrations. We've seen that, for example, in China, between China and Hong Kong. There's a bridge. There are hundreds of thousands of travelers and workers every day coming home and back, and every time they do an entry and exit registration. As I said before, it's already a normative reference. That's what ICAO, as a specialized organization from the United Nations, does. They talk a lot, they provide a lot of paper, and then they'll access it and publish it. As you see, this is the version of October last year. And therefore, there is already a relation with normative references. When we see the differences, then from my perspective as a member of the an employee of the government, I'm always concerned about the last thing, and that is the interoperability. What we do in Europe will perfectly work in Europe, but does not work in the rest of the world. What ICAO does can be working in the whole world, but it needs to be adapted. We have to talk about it. Do we have the right interpretation of the rules they're stating, and can we test with each other? That is a lot of work still to do and always to do. And if we do it right, then citizens will be crushed between the wheels, to speak it in that way. That was my presentation.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Gosh, can you say something, if you're not comfortable saying it, what are the Netherlands doing with the DTC VC, so the type 1? Are we doing something?
We as the Netherlands?
Yeah.
We're in test, yeah. With the RVIG, the government body for the registrations from the inhabitants, they're coming to a digital ID. And I'm not sure when it will happen, but the process is going. But it's on a small basis right now.
It's all POCs and small pilots, right? Do you know of any larger scale live things already being done?
At this moment?
Yeah, somewhere in the world. Do you know what's like the poster boy for
not right
users?
now. Due to COVID, my observation is that it's pretty much came to a standstill for that reason. There were some developments, but the last year and a half they didn't really make big steps.
So we're involved in one in Canada where we use this for travel, for Canadian, but it's really also like tens or hundreds of people, right? It's very, very small scale.
And it's pretty much similar to a registered travel program. So, but we're trying, we'll move on, but it's not with big steps, it's more baby steps.
No other questions? Then I have a question. Well, my question was also going to be, where are the pilots? But speaking from experience, I know there aren't many, unfortunately. I can think of a few. Call me if you, if you have an idea. But I wanted to ask Simon and Manuel, how will this affect your issues with identity and the onboarding? And that is my first question. And the second question, what impact could that have on the customers that are booking your trip? And for the customers, your travelers that are using Uber? Who can I?
So I can start. So on the first case, basically for corporate access, we go to exactly what was mentioned in the presentation. If it's a solution only for Europe, for example, and cannot be global, we will have to either create two different onboarding processes, or have this as an input for that identity validation vendor. They indeed have multiple sources of inbound identity that they need to validate. This could be one, and we still have one single flow with them. For the purpose of validating the customer, making the trip, then it actually is much more by the book use case, right? So it's exactly what's intended for. So in that case, I would definitely argue against trying to find something alternative, because it's already being solved by sovereign states. So let's leverage what they're doing, of course.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Because, and before, a quick question, because the ICAO DTC digital travel credential is not intended to be used outside of travel. But of course, we use our We use our passport outside of travel. So I'm sure that the DTC Type 1 can be used for, It is.
But we see in general that goal is moving. We've seen it, for example, with our health certificates for our apps, because they will also be distributed by ICAO.
The VDS, the virtual digital seal.
Yeah, but it's a different type, because it's about health and not about travel. So they have to create a different branch, an own branch for it. So you will see it will be a broader perspective than only travel.
The same way we use a passport.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simon.
So I think we can segregate off, so to speak, Europe, which then obviously is not UK. So the EU. If it's across the EU, then it's already really helpful, because what it does, it will take out cost and friction of establishing it, for the simple reason that there's not a lot of paperwork literally being used. It would make it even more useful if once the identity has been validated, it's possible to pull in the required permits as an attribute. What we discussed before. So that's a really relevant second step, in particular also when changes in these permits, because they're all time-based and could be withdrawn, are also presented. So it would take a lot of friction out of the process. So that's on the, let's call it earner side. On the traveler side, well, I also see another direction for the travelers, which actually is for travelers to be able to move around the world in an anonymous fashion and not having to identify themselves when they board. So there's a tension there which we need to also resolve and allow these options. On the other hand, we used to have, for instance, credit card payments for passengers. There's also a drive to enable cash payments again.
Okay.
In certain areas, for the simple reason that not everybody is eligible for a credit card. So it opens up to us, to people that were excluded in the past. So there's that kind of elements.
Yeah, in some countries it's really difficult to even open a bank account.
That's not necessarily in Europe, but across the world that is a topic.
And you are
in Latin, for instance.
So this will have a huge impact.
At a level of efficiency, and because it's more efficient, costs go down, which allows you to be more accurate and precise and less forgiving in things that go wrong. So hopefully, but that still needs to be demonstrated, safety will go up.
Yeah, safety will go up, and that links me to booking, because if you book a trip at Booking, you start a chain of stakeholders that will be connected with the data, and once you upload for instance, your DTC at a booking, this has a huge impact on that chain, because you will have more secure data. And you can share that data with the airline, even API, Advanced Passenger Information, with the government, even your hotel can only... Yeah. Are there any plans at Booking to take this into account and to...
At that level, I think it's probably a little bit too early for us. But for me, the important thing is that rather than sharing that, it's basically creating that pipeline.
Yeah.
The moment that identity is provided, it basically can flow to all of those steps in the chain. But also you need some governance and access control on that. So who can I actually share that identity with? Because what if I make some reservations that I want to keep anonymous for whatever reason? Are we saying, hey, by the way, this person is the one making the reservation? So it needs to be also have that layer of access control on top of the identity itself.
Yeah. A lot has to be taken into account, and a lot of the privacy by design.
Or confidential, because there is a difference being anonymous and being confidential. I don't know how we will do an anonymous travel for security reasons. I don't know how these two can match. Sure. I think it can be confidential. I can give my access to the person that I want. Not everybody needs to know. So I think it's different.
Exactly. But keep in mind, so maybe not the travel itself, but certain activities you take along that travel. So let's say something very, very absurd, but I go to a strip club when I'm in whatever seat. So maybe I do that reservation through that channel. And when sharing my identity, if it's acceptable to keep that anonymous or confidential, it needs to be absolutely ensured that my identity will not be shared with the provider of the service.
But for a hotel, they cannot do that because they need to get a list. It's like the passenger name list. They also exist. So
Well, I do think we could in the future travel anonymously, fly anonymously, as long as the airline knows that the government where you're going to and the country that you left are sure of your identity, and then a signal can be shared, and then it's you know, data minimization to the core. Theoretically, it can happen because well, we're working on a lot of things in IATA to make that to get there in the end. It may seem futuristic, but
it's basically telling the airline, don't worry, this travel is validated. I'm just not telling you who they are.
yeah, exactly. And airlines will be very happy if that happens because it means
it's interesting because you're sharing an attribute without the identity, or at least a very similar small subset.
yeah. But this is future. For now, it will not be
also
there.
becomes to trust then. Also in the exchange
Exactly.
in the exchange of data.
And still governments with lists of names that they really like to get off planes.
Well, the airlines have their but in this scenario, always the government.
And you don't know that you're on it until you hit passport.
Now, airlines have these blacklists indeed, but and of course, governments will always need to have all the data. That is the core of this, and this is why this is such an important step. There is an issue still that not every country has an e-passport or an machine-readable travel document. So the 80/20 is also comes back in that respect.
That's true, but coverage from traveler perspective is more than 95%. So the countries that have not an e-passport yet are not having much travelers around the world.
Yeah, which is India and Mexico, for instance.
India now started, right?
Yeah.
India now started, so there will be another billion people, but it will take 10 years, right?
And interesting because you, I think.
It's okay, apparently.
I think it was Henk who mentioned Aadhaar just now, and they also have a digital identity for travel called DigiYatra that they're developing now. So they're really taking this, but very inward focused, and of course they have a lot of domestic travel, but not many people have a passport.
50 out of the 200 countries have e-passports, but 100 of them, roughly 100 share their actual country certificate, right? So I think your list will probably have about 100 countries on it, right? And not 150.
A little bit more than that.
Yeah, so order of magnitude, right? So, but proportional to the travelers, then you get into the high 90%.
Exactly.
And that was my comment, to the booking, is that if you hire people randomly over the world, then that 95 or 97 doesn't apply. Well, if you're in travel, that does apply.
Absolutely, and this brings me to another question I have for Core, because if Booking and Uber would like to use either the European or the DTC, they would need to have access to the key to verify. And would there be commercial use to get access to this list?
Yes.
Is it planned? What is the perspective? Because that is...
Core publishes this on his website, so we can leverage all his hard work.
Yeah, but that's also then we do it, and that's not a big basis of trust. You want to have the trust from the broadest perspective, but it's planned for next year because it's on decision for end October.
For the Dutch government?
No, for ICAO.
For ICAO?
Yeah.
Okay, for just opening it worldwide. Yeah. Well, okay.
The Germans do it and the Dutch do it. We all trust Core, right? Who doesn't trust Core here?
Is it Core?
Yeah, is it Core? I've seen it before. I think it is.
Quite an anchor.
Yeah. We are at lunch break. Are there any, would you like?
I'd just like to comment before we break for lunch, if it's okay?
Yeah, sure.
Just to remind you all, we're doing a conference after lunch. So if you have any topics, these topics or something, put it up on the yellow stickers and we can decide. The conference is going to be discussions at different tables. So we won't have topics. So if you have thought of something, please go in the conference board and fill in your topic.
That is a great idea. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you to the speakers. One last round of applause.